It was a typical Friday night, and I found myself home alone. My husband was away on a business trip, and I relished the rare moments of solitude. I decided to spend the evening watching movies, nestled comfortably on the couch with a bowl of popcorn. As the clock neared midnight, the sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the quiet house. I was engrossed in a thriller when an unexpected noise shattered the silence, a knock at the front door. I paused the movie, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. Another knock, louder this time, echoed through the house. My unease deepened. Who would be visiting at this hour, especially on such a stormy night? I cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. A man stood there, drenched by the pouring rain, his face partially obscured by the hood of his raincoat. He held a feeble smile on his lips, an attempt to appear harmless. His shaggy hair was plastered to his forehead. Through the closed door, he shouted, "Excuse me, ma'am. I hate to bother you, but my car's broken down a few blocks away. Can I use your phone to call for help?" A chill ran down my spine as my instinct screamed at me to be cautious. I hesitated for a moment before finally unlocking the door's chain lock and cracking it open just enough to speak. "Who are you? What do you need?" I asked, trying to sound firm. He appeared relieved that I'd opened the door slightly. "Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm just a bit stranded out here, and my phone died in this weather. I promise I won't take long." Against my better judgment, I opened the door wider, allowing him into the small entryway. Rainwater dripped from his clothes onto the floor as he stepped inside. He appeared disheveled and anxious. I pointed to the landline phone on a small table nearby, silently warning myself to stay vigilant. "The phone's right there. Please make your call and leave." As he reached for the phone, I couldn't help but notice how nervous he seemed. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed a number, and I strained to listen to his conversation. But instead of calling for help, he muttered something inaudible before abruptly hanging up. Turning toward me, he said, "It seems I couldn't reach anyone. Mind if I use your restroom? I'll be out of your way shortly." I was growing increasingly uneasy, my gut screaming at me that something was very wrong. But I couldn't find a good reason to refuse his request. "Fine, it's down the hall to the left. But please hurry." He nodded with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and disappeared down the hall. As soon as he was out of sight, I quickly locked the front door and grabbed my cell phone from the coffee table, ready to dial 911 if things took a turn for the worse. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, my mind racing with all the possible dangers this stranger might pose. Finally, he emerged from the hallway, his coat draped over his arm. He looked at me with an eerie grin. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You've been such a good host." I felt a cold dread wash over me as I realized that he had no intention of leaving. Panic welled up inside me, but I tried to maintain composure. "You've overstayed your welcome. It's time for you to go now." His smile widened, revealing a predatory glint in his eyes. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. You see, I knew you'd be alone tonight, and I couldn't resist the opportunity." My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone, ready to call for help. But he lunged forward, knocking the phone from my hand and pinning me against the wall. Fear gripped me as he whispered, "You should never open the door to strangers, dear." In that moment, I knew I had to fight for my life. With all the strength I could muster, I elbowed him in the stomach and broke free from his grasp. I sprinted toward the front door, my heart racing as I fumbled with the lock. Just as I flung the door open and burst out into the pouring rain, I heard his heavy footsteps behind me. I ran to the nearest neighbor's house, banging on their door, praying they would answer in time. The door swung open, revealing a startled neighbor. I blurted out that a man was chasing me, and they quickly called the police. Moments later, sirens wailed in the distance. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished into the night. They searched the area but found no trace of him. The ordeal left me shaken to my core, a stark reminder of the dangers that could lurk just beyond our front doors. From that night on, I never opened my door to a stranger again, no matter how convincing their story might be. It was a typical Friday night, and I found myself home alone. I decided to treat myself to a cozy evening in. The rain was tapping lightly against the windows as I curled up on the couch with a good book. Around 8:30 p.m., the sound of thunder echoed through the house, and I realized I was getting hungry. Pizza sounded like the perfect comfort food for a rainy night, so I grabbed my phone and dialed the local pizzeria. After a brief conversation with the friendly dispatcher, I placed my order and settled back into my book. The estimated delivery time was about 45 minutes, which gave me plenty of time to lose myself in the pages. As the minutes passed, I began to hear the faint rumble of an approaching motorcycle. I figured it was just a neighbor, not giving it much thought. When the doorbell rang, I jumped up, slightly startled by the sudden noise. I opened the door to find the pizza delivery guy, a young man with a cap and a pizza box in hand. He greeted me with a warm smile and handed me the pizza, making small talk as I paid. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I thanked him and closed the door, eagerly digging into my delicious pizza. As I savored each bite, I continued to read my book, losing track of time. It must have been an hour or so later when I heard the same motorcycle approaching once again. I frowned, thinking it was unusual for a delivery guy to return. But curiosity got the best of me, and I went to the window to see what was happening. To my shock, it was indeed the same pizza delivery guy. He parked his motorcycle and walked up to my doorstep with another pizza box in hand. This time, his friendly smile had morphed into a strange grin. My heart began to race as I opened the door. "Did you order another pizza?" he asked, his tone oddly cheerful. "No," I stammered, my voice shaky. "I only ordered one." He handed me the second box, still grinning, and insisted it was paid for. I was too nervous to argue, so I took it. But as soon as I closed the door, a sinking feeling gripped me. Something was seriously wrong. I called the pizzeria immediately, wanting to confirm whether they had sent a second pizza or if this was some bizarre prank. The dispatcher on the other end sounded confused and assured me that they hadn't received any new orders from my address. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the unsettling truth: I was alone in my house, with a strange man who had somehow duplicated the pizza delivery and showed up at my door a second time. Terrified, I decided to call the police, explaining the bizarre situation. They promised to send an officer right away, instructing me to lock all the doors and windows and stay on the line with them. As I waited anxiously, I glanced out the window and saw the pizza guy still standing there, now staring intently at my front door. It felt like an eternity before the police finally arrived. They confronted the man outside, and I could hear a heated exchange of words through the closed door. Eventually, they handcuffed him and took him away in their squad car. An officer came inside to take my statement, assuring me that they would investigate further. I learned that this guy had a history of stalking behavior and had been fired from the pizzeria months ago. The relief that washed over me was immense, but the lingering fear of what could have happened at night haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched and followed, and I installed security cameras around my home. In the end, it turned out to be a disturbing and chilling encounter with a man who had sinister intentions. I shudder to think about what might have occurred if I hadn't been cautious and called the police. The memory of that rainy night still sends shivers down my spine, a constant reminder that danger can sometimes lurk behind the most ordinary circumstances. It was a chilly, moonless night, and I found myself alone at home. My husband was away on a business trip, and the solitude felt eerie in the silence of our suburban house. I had just settled into bed, wrapping myself in the warmth of the blankets when my phone rang, its shrill tone shattering the stillness. I glanced at the clock. It read 2 a.m. Who could be calling at this ungodly hour? I reluctantly picked up the phone, feeling a sense of unease creep over me. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling. The voice on the other end was low and familiar, sending shivers down my spine. "Did you miss me, darling?" My heart leaped into my throat. I knew that voice all too well. It was my ex-boyfriend, Mark. We had parted ways under unpleasant circumstances, and I had hoped never to hear from him again. "How did you get this number?" I demanded, my voice quivering. Mark chuckled, a sinister sound that seemed to ooze through the phone. "I have my ways, sweetheart. I've been watching you, you know." My blood ran cold as his words sank in. The very idea that Mark could be watching me filled me with dread. I glanced around the dimly lit room, paranoia consuming me. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice quaking with fear. He went on, recounting personal details about my day, mentioning places I had been and things I had done. Panic surged through me, and I realized that he had been spying on me, tracking my every move. Terror began to consume me as Mark continued his unsettling monologue. He spoke about our past, our relationship, and how he believed we were destined to be together. He professed his love, but it was tainted with an eerie obsession. "I'm coming for you, my love," he declared before hanging up. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my mind racing as I contemplated the meaning behind his ominous words. Was he really on his way to my house? I quickly dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. The police promised to send an officer to check on me, but the minutes dragged on like hours as I waited in agonizing fear. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind rattling the windows, sent me into a state of heightened paranoia. Finally, the doorbell rang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I rushed to the door and flung it open, relieved to see the uniformed police officer standing there. He assured me that they would patrol the area and offered to stay nearby until morning for my safety. I agreed, grateful for the presence of someone to protect me from Mark's deranged intentions. The rest of the night was spent in a state of vigilance, the officer patiently comforting me while we awaited any sign of Mark. But he never showed, and as dawn broke, the officer left with a stern warning to call immediately if Mark resurfaced. Over the following weeks, I lived in constant fear, looking over my shoulder at every turn. The police were never able to apprehend Mark, and I began to doubt whether I would ever find peace. The chilling encounter had left me traumatized, a prisoner in my own home. I had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood, seeking a fresh start in life. The past few days had been filled with unpacking boxes and getting used to the unfamiliar surroundings. As I settled into my new home, the sense of isolation began to creep in. It was a peaceful neighborhood, but the unfamiliarity of it all was unsettling. One evening, as the clock ticked towards 11 p.m., I was home alone. My new house felt strange in the dim glow of the living room lamp. I was lounging on the couch, trying to unwind after a long day, when the doorbell rang, shattering the silence of the night. I glanced at the clock, puzzled by the late-night visitor. Who on earth could it be at this hour? I cautiously approached the front door and peered through the peephole. On the other side stood a man, middle-aged and average-looking, dressed casually. I hesitated for a moment but decided to open the door. He smiled warmly, which put me slightly at ease. "Hey there, neighbor," he greeted, extending his hand for a handshake. "I live just down the street," and I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. Relieved that it was just a friendly neighbor, I shook his hand and introduced myself. He seemed like a friendly guy, and I figured it was a nice gesture to introduce myself to someone in the neighborhood. We chatted about the area, and he even shared some helpful tips about living there. But as the conversation continued, something began to feel off. He started asking more personal questions about my work, my daily routines, and whether I lived alone. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. Why was he so curious about my life? I began to feel uncomfortable and tried to steer the conversation away from personal topics. However, he persisted, pressing me for information. His friendly demeanor had shifted, and he seemed increasingly fixated on prying into my life. My anxiety grew, and I made an excuse about needing to get up early the next day, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't budge. Instead, he insisted on coming inside for a cup of coffee, which I adamantly declined. As I stepped back from the doorway, I noticed his demeanor change again. His friendly smile had transformed into an unsettling grin. He took a step forward, invading my personal space, and said in a low, menacing voice, "I think I should come in." Panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, my heart racing. He began to pound on the door, shouting angrily, demanding to be let in. Fear coursed through my veins as I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 as quickly as my trembling hands would allow. The operator assured me that help was on the way, and I huddled in the corner of my living room, clutching my phone tightly. The man outside continued to bang on the door, growing increasingly agitated. He threatened to break in, his words becoming more menacing with each passing moment. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I could hear the sirens in the distance, growing louder, a welcome sound that brought relief. The pounding on the door ceased as the police pulled into my driveway, and the man was apprehended. Turns out, the man wasn't a neighbor at all but a complete stranger who had been lurking in the area. His intentions were unclear, but the terror he had instilled in me that night would linger for a long time. As the police took him away, I felt a wave of gratitude for their swift response and for my instincts that had told me something wasn't right. My parents had finally decided to have a date night after weeks of non-stop work. As a teenager, I was thrilled to have the house to myself for the evening. I had grand plans for a night of binge watching my favorite TV shows and indulging in all the snacks I could find in the kitchen. The house felt eerily quiet as I settled in for the evening. I turned on all the lights to dispel any shadows that might play tricks on my imagination. It was just me, my dog Max, and a bag of potato chips. The sound of rain outside added to the cozy atmosphere, and I felt safe and snug on the couch. Hours passed as I watched episode after episode, and my parents' absence was almost forgotten. That was until I heard the faint sound of creaking from upstairs. Max, my usually fearless and boisterous German shepherd, had perked up, his ears alert. I muted the TV and strained to listen. It was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then, unmistakable footsteps echoed from above. My heart began to race. My parents had left me alone, and I was on edge. Is someone there? I called out, trying to sound confident. There was no response, just the sound of the rain drumming on the windows. I considered calling my parents, but I didn't want to worry them on their date night. It was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me, I thought. I reluctantly resumed my show, but my unease lingered. Max remained vigilant, his eyes fixed on the staircase. That's when I heard a door creaking open upstairs. Panic seized me. There was no denying it now. Someone was in the house. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents, hoping they would see my message without being disturbed on their date. "I think someone's in the house," I typed, my fingers trembling. I waited, watching the screen, praying for a response. Minutes passed like hours, and still no reply. I couldn't wait any longer. I decided to call 911. As I spoke to the dispatcher, my voice trembled as I described the situation. They assured me that police were on their way and to stay on the line. With Max by my side, I crept to the hallway and glanced up the stairs. The faint glow of the upstairs hallway light revealed a dark figure standing at the top of the stairs. My blood ran cold. It was a man, a stranger, and he was just standing there, watching me. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I stifled a scream as I retreated back to the living room, clutching my phone. I whispered to the dispatcher that there was someone in the house, and they urged me to lock myself in a room. I dashed to the nearest bedroom, slammed the door shut, and barricaded it with whatever furniture I could find. Max was with me, barking furiously. My parents still hadn't replied to my messages, and my fear grew with each passing second. The sound of sirens approaching outside was a lifeline. The police had arrived. I explained my location to the dispatcher and told them I could hear the intruder moving around upstairs. Minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots coming down the stairs. The intruder was heading my way. My heart pounded, and I was ready to defend myself and Max with anything I could find. But then, I heard the voices of the police officers. They were shouting for the intruder to drop to the ground. There was a struggle, followed by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. It was over. The police burst into the room, their guns drawn, ensuring the intruder was apprehended. I felt a rush of relief, but my hands were still trembling. The man was arrested and taken away in the back of a police car. As the officers took my statement, my parents finally arrived home, shocked and horrified by what had occurred. It turned out that the intruder had broken in, thinking the house was empty, but had been startled by Max and my presence. I shuddered to think of what might have happened if I hadn't locked myself in the room and called the police. That night, I learned a valuable lesson about the importance of staying vigilant, even when you think you're safe at home. It had been 3 long months since I lost my husband. The grief still hung heavy in the air, and our once cozy home felt emptier with every passing day. I was struggling to adjust to life as a widow, trying to find solace in the routine of everyday tasks. One chilly night, I was alone in the house. The solitude had become my constant companion, and I had grown accustomed to the silence. I was in the living room, engrossed in a book, attempting to escape my sorrow through the pages of a mystery novel. The rain outside pattered gently against the windows, providing a soothing background noise. As I turned the pages, my thoughts drifted back to my husband. He had been the love of my life, and his absence left a void that could never be filled. Our home was a testament to the life we had built together, and the memories within these walls were bittersweet reminders of happier times. That's when I heard it, an unmistakable creaking sound, like the back door slowly inching open. Panic surged through me, and I froze in my seat. My husband had always been the one to handle home security, and now I was alone, feeling vulnerable and exposed. I strained my ears, hoping it was just my imagination, but then I heard another noise, a faint, shuffling sound, like footsteps on the hardwood floor. My heart raced, and I knew I had to act. I gently set my book aside and tiptoed to the hallway, clutching the phone in my trembling hand. I reached the hallway and peered around the corner, my pulse pounding in my ears. The back door was slightly ajar, and the dim light from the kitchen spilled into the hallway. I could see nothing but shadows. Fear gripped me, but I knew I had to investigate. With trembling hands, I grabbed an umbrella from the stand by the front door. It was the closest thing I could find that might be used for defense. I edged closer to the kitchen, trying to muffle my footsteps. Max, our loyal Labrador, was curled up by the fireplace, oblivious to the intruder's presence. I entered the kitchen, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw him, a silhouette standing near the back door. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the figure, a shiver running down my spine. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. The figure didn't respond, just stood there, unmoving. I took a cautious step forward, my grip on the umbrella tightening. As I got closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, tall and dressed in dark clothing. His back was to me, and he seemed to be fumbling with something by the back door. I couldn't see his face, and that uncertainty filled me with dread. Summoning all my courage, I raised the umbrella and called out again, this time with more authority. I said, "Who are you?" The man finally turned around to face me. His features were obscured by a hood, casting his face in shadow. I could feel his gaze on me, piercing through the darkness. In a low, chilling voice, he finally spoke. "I just needed shelter from the rain." His words sent a shiver down my spine. His explanation seemed implausible, and I knew I couldn't trust this stranger. Summoning every ounce of strength, I raised the umbrella defensively and took a step back, keeping a safe distance. "You need to leave," I said firmly, my voice trembling but resolute. "I'm calling the police." The man hesitated for a moment, his dark eyes never leaving mine. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the back door. I followed him, making sure to maintain my distance, ready to defend myself if necessary. He slipped out into the rainy night, and I watched as he disappeared into the darkness. I quickly locked the back door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the latch. It was over, but the terror of the encounter lingered. I called the police, explaining what had happened. They arrived within minutes, their presence providing a sense of security that had been shattered earlier. They searched the area but found no trace of the intruder. As I sat with the officers, recounting the terrifying encounter, I couldn't help but think about my husband. He had always been my protector, and now I had to learn to protect myself. The nights would never be the same, and the scars of that chilling encounter would remain with me forever. In the days that followed, I had the locks changed, installed an alarm system, and adopted a new routine for safety. The sense of security that my husband had provided was gone, but I was determined to rebuild my life and face the future with resilience. It was a cold and rainy night, the kind that made you appreciate the warmth and coziness of your own home. My girlfriend, Sarah, had gone to stay with her mother for a few days. She wasn't feeling well, and I had insisted that she needed the comfort of her childhood home. I was home alone, and the emptiness of the house felt eerie, even with the soft hum of the TV in the background. I had just settled down on the couch with a bowl of microwave popcorn when I heard a loud, urgent knocking on the front door. Startled, I paused the TV and looked at the clock. It was already 10:30 p.m. Who could be visiting at this hour? I cautiously made my way to the front door, my heart pounding with unease. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man standing on my doorstep. He was dressed in plain clothes and had a badge hanging from a lanyard around his neck. He looked official, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I cautiously opened the door just a crack, leaving the chain lock securely fastened. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice filled with suspicion. The man gave me a practiced smile and spoke with a sense of urgency. "Sir, I'm an undercover police officer, and we've had reports of a break-in nearby. I need to ask you a few questions." Is it all right if I come in? Alarm bells went off in my head. I'd always been taught to be cautious about letting strangers into my home, especially late at night. I'm sorry, but I can't let you in, I replied firmly. If you have questions, we can talk right here. The man's smile faded, and he became more insistent. It's really important, and time is of the essence. I promise I won't take long. I hesitated for a moment, torn between wanting to be helpful and the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, I made a quick decision. Hold on, let me call the police station to verify your identity. I closed the door and quickly dialed the non-emergency number for our local police station. As I waited for someone to pick up, anxiety gnawed at me. The man on my doorstep was still there, no doubt wondering what was taking me so long. A voice answered on the other end, and I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me that an officer would be sent over to verify the man's identity. Feeling somewhat relieved, I returned to the door and told the man that I had called the police station to confirm his status. He seemed unnerved by this and took a step back. I kept the chain lock secured and waited for the officer to arrive. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, the tension in the air growing thicker. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. The man on my doorstep must have seen it too, because he turned and hurried away, disappearing into the darkness. The uniformed police officer arrived, and I explained the entire situation to him. He nodded and told me I had made the right call. He confirmed that there had been no reports of any break-ins in the area and assured me that I had handled the situation correctly. Relieved but still shaken, I thanked the officer and watched as he drove away. I locked and bolted the door, double-checked all the windows, and even called Sarah to let her know what had happened. She urged me to stay vigilant and cautious. The rest of the night was restless. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. What if I had let that man into my home? What had he really wanted? The unanswered questions haunted me as I tried to get some sleep. The next morning, Sarah returned home. I recounted the strange encounter to her, and she shared my unease. We decided to inform the police about the incident, just in case. They took our statements and promised to investigate. Weeks passed, and the incident slowly faded from our minds. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, and the emptiness of the house felt less eerie with Sarah by my side. Then, one evening, I received a call from the police. They had identified the man who had come to my door that night. He wasn't a police officer at all. He had a history of posing as one to gain access to people's homes. The police had apprehended him, and he was now in custody. The news sent a chill down my spine. I had narrowly escaped a potentially dangerous situation. It was a chilling encounter that served as a stark reminder to always trust my instincts and prioritize my safety, especially when home alone. That night, as Sarah and I locked up the house and settled into bed, I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of gratitude for her presence and the safety we found in each other's arms. The nightmare had passed, but the lessons it had taught us would remain forever etched in our minds. It was a sunny afternoon, and I found myself at home alone, enjoying the rare tranquility of an empty house. My husband was at work, and the neighborhood was unusually quiet. The only sounds were the chirping birds and the distant hum of lawnmowers from the neighboring yards. I was engrossed in a book when I heard a knock on the front door. Glancing at the clock, I wondered who could be visiting at this time of day. As I approached the door, I could see a teenage boy standing on the porch through the frosted glass window. He wore a tattered t-shirt, jeans, and had a lawnmower parked on the sidewalk. I opened the door, and he greeted me with a friendly smile. "Hi, ma'am," he said politely. "I noticed your lawn could use a mowing." I'm trying to earn some extra money. Would you like me to take care of it for you? I appreciated the initiative and smiled back. Oh, thank you, but I think we're okay for now. My husband usually handles the yard work. The boy nodded, his smile fading slightly, and he stepped back. All right, no problem. If you change your mind, here's my number. He handed me a small slip of paper with his name, Kyle, and a phone number written on it. I thanked him and closed the door, returning to my book. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I wish I had been more cautious. About an hour later, there was another knock at the door. I got up and opened it, half expecting to see Kyle again. And there he was, holding his lawnmower. Ma'am, are you sure you don't want your lawn mowed? It'll look great, I promise, he urged. I sighed, realizing that my husband wouldn't be able to get to it for a while. Okay, Kyle, go ahead. Just make sure not to make too much noise. He grinned and got to work. I watched him from the window as he expertly maneuvered the lawnmower around the yard. He seemed diligent and hardworking, so I decided to go outside and offer him a cold drink. I approached Kyle, who had taken off his earbuds, and handed him a bottle of water. Thanks for doing this, I said, trying to make small talk. How long have you been doing lawn care? He accepted the drink and took a sip before answering. A few years now. It's a good way to make some cash. I nodded, feeling a bit more at ease. Well, we appreciate it. Just let me know if you need anything else. Kyle continued to work, and I went back inside, relieved to have found a solution for our overgrown lawn. But as I settled back into my book, a feeling of unease began to gnaw at me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the situation didn't sit right. Eventually, I decided to check on Kyle's progress. When I stepped out onto the porch, I was puzzled to find the lawnmower abandoned in the middle of the yard. Kyle was nowhere in sight. My heart began to race, and I called out, "Kyle? Are you okay?" Silence. I approached the lawnmower, my anxiety growing with every step. Then, I heard a soft, eerie sound coming from inside the house. It was the unmistakable creaking of the staircase. My mind raced as I realized that Kyle must have entered the house without my knowledge. Panic set in, and I had to gather every ounce of courage to ascend the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity. As I reached the top of the staircase, my worst fears were realized. There was Kyle, standing in the hallway, facing the wall, his back to me. He was muttering something incoherent under his breath. "Kyle?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" He turned to face me slowly, his eyes vacant and unblinking. His clothes were smeared with dirt and grass stains, and his hands were clenched into fists. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Kyle, you need to leave right now." But instead of responding, he began to advance toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. It was as if he were in a trance, his eyes devoid of recognition. Fear surged through me, and I turned and ran down the stairs as fast as I could, my only thought being to get out of the house. I heard Kyle's heavy footsteps behind me, and I knew I had to make it to the front door before he caught up. I burst through the front door, stumbling out onto the porch, and didn't look back until I had reached the safety of the front yard. Kyle was standing in the doorway, his vacant stare fixed on me. I dialed 911, my trembling fingers struggling to press the buttons on my phone. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, and they assured me that officers were on their way. As I waited for the police to arrive, I kept a wary eye on Kyle, who hadn't moved from the doorway. His blank expression never wavered, and it sent shivers down my spine. When the police finally arrived, they detained Kyle and questioned him about his bizarre behavior. He claimed to have no memory of entering the house and appeared genuinely confused about the entire situation. I provided a statement to the police, and they assured me they would investigate further. It was clear that something was seriously wrong with Kyle, and I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and unease as they took him away for evaluation. In the days that followed, I learned that Kyle had a history of mental health issues. He had recently stopped taking his medication, which might have contributed to his erratic behavior. The incident was chilling, a stark reminder of how unpredictable and frightening mental illness can be. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that had settled over me. My sense of safety in my own home had been shattered, and I knew it would take time to rebuild. My husband and I took steps to improve our home security, and I couldn't help but wonder how differently things might have ended if I had let my guard down just a bit more that day. It was a Wednesday night, and I was home alone, preparing dinner in the dimly lit kitchen. The savory aroma of sizzling ground beef and spices filled the air as I cooked tacos for my son and myself. It was a simple evening, with the promise of my son returning from a friend's house for dinner. The clock on the wall read 8:30 p.m., and my stomach rumbled in anticipation. I had just set the table, complete with all the taco fixings, when I heard a faint but persistent knocking at the front door. My heart leaped with excitement, thinking my son had returned earlier than expected and had forgotten his keys. Hastily wiping my hands on a kitchen towel, I made my way to the front door and peered through the peephole. To my surprise, it wasn't my son standing on the porch, but an older man, a complete stranger. His face was hidden in the shadows, and I couldn't make out any features. With caution, I unlatched the chain lock and cracked the door open just a few inches. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice laced with unease. The man seemed friendly enough, though his presence on my doorstep at this hour was unsettling. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," he began, his voice calm and measured. "My car broke down a couple of blocks away, and I don't have my phone with me. Could I use your phone to call for assistance?" I hesitated, torn between the desire to help and my instincts telling me to be cautious. I'd heard too many stories of scams and cons. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you inside," I replied, trying to sound firm but polite. "I can call for help for you, though." Before I could pull out my phone, his demeanor shifted abruptly. His friendly expression twisted into an unsettling smile, and his eyes bore into mine. "I'm sure we can work something out, ma'am. Let me in, and I'll make it worth your while." My heart pounded as dread washed over me. This was not the innocent request for help it had seemed at first. My instinct screamed at me to shut the door and call the police. I moved to close it, but the man's foot shot out, wedging it open. Panic surged through me as he began to force his way inside, his strength overpowering my attempts to resist. Fear gripped me as I realized that I was in a life-or-death struggle with a stranger in my own home. Summoning every ounce of strength and adrenaline-fueled courage, I pushed back with all my might and managed to slam the door shut, locking it just in time. The man outside pounded on the door, his threats and pleas growing more desperate by the second. Tears welled up in my eyes as I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, my voice trembling as I pleaded for help. They assured me that officers were on the way. As I waited for the police to arrive, I barricaded myself in the bathroom, clutching the phone tightly in my trembling hands. The man continued to pound on the door, shouting obscenities and threats. The minutes felt like an eternity as I listened to his relentless efforts to break in. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the night, and relief washed over me. The police arrived quickly, and I could hear them shouting at the intruder to surrender. The man's resistance was short-lived, and soon he was in police custody. I emerged from the bathroom, shaken but unharmed, and gave my statement to the officers. They explained that the man had a history of criminal activity and had been wanted for other violent offenses. It sent chills down my spine to think about what could have happened if I had let him inside. After the ordeal was over, I called my son and told him to stay at his friend's house for the night. I couldn't bear the thought of him returning to a home that had just been the scene of a terrifying encounter. It was a quiet Monday evening, and I had settled into my cozy home office, busily working on my laptop. The soft glow of the desk lamp provided a warm contrast to the darkening room as the sun dipped below the horizon. My husband was away on a business trip, and I relished the solitude, finding it conducive to getting work done. As I was engrossed in my tasks, the faint sound of a knock at the door barely registered. I glanced at the clock. It was already past 7 p.m. Who could be visiting at this hour? I rose from my desk and made my way to the front door, feeling a sense of unease. When I opened the door, I was greeted by an unexpected sight. 2 children, a boy and a girl, stood on my doorstep. They looked to be around 10 or 11 years old. The boy spoke up, his voice shaky. "Ma'am, we're really sorry to bother you, but we're trying to get home, and we need $5 for the bus. Can you help us?" My initial suspicion waned as I looked at their earnest faces, and my heart went out to them. I rummaged through my purse and handed them a $5 bill, hoping it would help them on their way. They thanked me profusely, and then the boy hesitated before asking, "Could I use your bathroom, please? It's been a long walk." I considered their request for a moment, torn between being a good Samaritan and the instinctive caution that had always been ingrained in me. Finally, I agreed, leading them down the hall to the bathroom. As they went in, I retreated to the living room, keeping the door ajar. An hour passed, and I returned to my work, believing that I had done a good deed and that the children were now on their way home. However, as the minutes ticked by, a growing unease settled in the pit of my stomach. It shouldn't have taken them so long in the bathroom. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check on them. As I approached the bathroom, I heard faint noises from inside, shuffling sounds that made my heart race. I pushed the door open slowly, revealing a scene that sent a chill down my spine. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the evening breeze. Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. I had been lured into a trap. Those innocent-looking children had unlocked my window, and now a man was climbing through it, his eyes filled with malice. Before I could react, the intruder was inside my home, blocking my path to the door. Fear and adrenaline coursed through me as I scrambled to find a way out. He moved closer, his intentions clear, and I knew I had to act fast. With a surge of strength, I bolted towards the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the counter, clutching it tightly as I turned to face the intruder. He advanced with a predatory smile, thinking he had the upper hand. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I swung the skillet with all my might, striking him square in the face. He let out a scream of pain and stumbled back, crashing into a chair. It bought me just enough time to make a run for it. I dashed out the back door, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the man cursing and giving chase, but adrenaline fueled my escape. I sprinted through the dimly lit backyard, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I reached my neighbor's house. Pounding on their door, I begged for help, and they quickly called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived, and they apprehended the intruder in my backyard. As they arrested him, I watched, a mixture of relief and anger coursing through me. It turned out that the children at the door were pawns in the man's sinister plot, used to gain entry into my home. The police assured me that they would be okay and that they would contact their parents. As for the man, he had a long history of criminal activity and had clearly intended to do me harm. In the aftermath of that horrifying encounter, I strengthened the security of my home, installing robust locks and an alarm system. I also shared my story with friends and neighbors, warning them to be vigilant even in moments of apparent kindness. It was a quiet Thursday morning, and I was going about my usual routine in my small suburban home. Living alone, I had grown accustomed to the solitude, finding comfort in the peacefulness of my surroundings. The soft hum of appliances and the occasional chirping of birds were the soundtrack to my day. As I was sipping on my morning coffee and flipping through the pages of a book, a sudden knock at the door jolted me from my reverie. It was an unexpected interruption, and I frowned, wondering who could be calling at this early hour. My neighborhood was generally safe, but caution was ingrained in me. I peered through the peephole, my heart racing slightly. A man stood on my doorstep, dressed in casual attire. His presence seemed harmless enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He held up a badge with the name of the local electric company and explained that they needed to read the electric meter in my basement. It seemed like a plausible request, and I hesitated for a moment before deciding to let him in. Leading him through the hallway to the basement door, I felt a shiver of apprehension, an instinctual warning that something was amiss. The man followed closely behind, his footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. As we descended into the dimly lit basement, I couldn't help but feel vulnerable. The basement was a place I rarely ventured, and it was filled with the eerie stillness of forgotten memories. I pointed to the electric meter, a small metal box affixed to the wall. The man nodded and approached it, pretending to inspect it closely. My heart pounded, and I watched him closely, growing increasingly uncomfortable. He was taking far too long for such a simple task. Suddenly, he turned towards me with a sinister smile that sent chills down my spine. It was then that I realized he was an imposter, a threat who had deceived his way into my home. Panic surged through me as he moved closer, blocking my path to the basement stairs. My mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this nightmare. I had to stay calm, to think clearly. I knew that my only chance of survival was to outsmart this intruder. I feigned cooperation, trying to maintain a facade of vulnerability. But as he reached out to grab me, I made a split-second decision. With all the strength I could muster, I hurled a nearby toolbox towards him, catching him off guard. It struck him on the shoulder, causing him to stumble backward and lose his balance. Seizing the opportunity, I sprinted up the stairs, my heart pounding like a drum. I reached the safety of the ground floor and bolted up the front door, not daring to look back. I knew that my life depended on reaching help quickly. I ran to my neighbor's house, pounding on the door and gasping out the terrifying ordeal I had just experienced. They called the police, who arrived promptly to apprehend the intruder. It turned out that he had a history of similar crimes, preying on unsuspecting victims by posing as a utility worker. In the aftermath of that horrifying encounter, I fortified my home security, installing locks, alarms, and surveillance cameras. I also shared my story with my neighbors, warning them to be vigilant against potential threats. The night was settling in, casting long shadows throughout my quiet suburban home. My husband was away on a business trip, and I was alone, a situation that had become routine over the years. As I settled onto the couch with a book and a warm blanket, I relished the solitude. But little did I know that this night would be unlike any other. As I turned the pages of my book, engrossed in the world of fiction, I began to hear faint noises from the back of the house. The creaking of the old wooden floors beneath me sent a chill down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as the usual sounds of an aging house, but something about it felt different tonight. My nerves were already on edge, knowing that I was the sole inhabitant of the house. I put the book down and listened intently. The noises continued, growing more distinct and unsettling. Footsteps, I thought. Someone was moving around in my home. Fear gripped me, and I reached for my phone to dial 911. My trembling fingers struggled to press the buttons as I whispered my address to the dispatcher. They assured me that help was on the way, but the minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. I decided to act cautiously, realizing that my safety depended on my ability to remain composed. I grabbed a heavy candlestick from the coffee table, the only weapon within arm's reach, and made my way towards the source of the noises. The intruder had to be stopped, and I was determined to protect my home. The intruder's steps grew louder as I approached the hallway leading to the back of the house. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and I wished I had turned on more lights before my husband's departure. I could see the faint outline of a figure, their back to me, as they moved through the hallway. With each step, my heart pounded in my chest, and my grip tightened on the candlestick. I was torn between confronting the intruder and finding a place to hide. But there was no turning back now. As I rounded the corner, I raised the candlestick, ready to strike. But when I saw the intruder's face, my breath caught in my throat. It was my husband, or at least, someone who looked exactly like him. The shock was overwhelming, and I stumbled backward, my grip on the candlestick loosening. He turned to face me, his expression cold and unfamiliar. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. He smiled, an eerie grin that sent shivers down my spine. "You don't recognize me, do you?" My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. My husband was miles away on his business trip, and this imposter before me defied explanation. He took a step closer, his eyes locked onto mine. "Where is he?" I demanded, my fear giving way to anger. The imposter's smile widened, and he raised a finger to his lips in a hushing gesture. "He's not here. And he won't be coming back." Terror surged through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. This man, whoever he was, had invaded my home and assumed my husband's identity. My fingers tightened around the candlestick once more, and I took a step back, my mind racing for a way to escape. Just as he advanced towards me, a barrage of police sirens filled the night, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow through the windows. The intruder froze, his smile fading, and he bolted towards the back door. I watched as the police apprehended him, taking him away in handcuffs. It turned out that the imposter had been stalking my husband during his business trip, gathering enough information to infiltrate our home and deceive me. The police assured me that he would be held accountable for his actions, but the ordeal left scars that ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. My husband returned from his trip, and we found solace in each other's presence, grateful for our safety. We reinforced the security of our home, knowing that the sanctity of our haven had been breached. The memory of that terrifying night still haunts my dreams, a constant reminder that even in the quietest moments, darkness can find a way in. It was an ordinary weekday, and I found myself alone at home. My husband was at work, and my friends were busy with their own lives. The solitude didn't bother me. In fact, I enjoyed the occasional peaceful day to myself. Little did I know that this day would soon turn into a nightmare. As I went about my daily routine, the doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. When I opened the door, a man stood there, dressed in a uniform with a delivery company logo. He held a package in his hand. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with a polite smile. "I have a parcel for you." Could you please sign for it? I was taken aback because I wasn't expecting any deliveries, but I thought it might be a surprise gift from a friend or family member. I nodded and accepted the package, ready to put my signature on his electronic device. That's when things took an unsettling turn. The delivery man extended the device toward me, but then he muttered, "Oh, my pen seems to have run out of ink. Do you have one I could borrow?" His request seemed harmless enough, but a nagging feeling of unease crept over me. I hesitated for a moment, weighing the situation. After all, I didn't want to be rude. With a forced smile, I told him to wait and retreated inside to find a pen. My heart pounded as I searched for a pen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I finally located one, I clutched it tightly in my hand, determined not to let my guard down. Returning to the door, I handed him the pen, my eyes fixed on his every move. He accepted it with a smile and pretended to scribble on the device. But as I watched, I noticed something chilling. He hadn't actually pressed the pen on the screen. Instead, he was stalling for time, and his eyes darted around the hallway. "Why aren't you signing?" I asked, my voice quivering with suspicion. He hesitated for a moment before responding, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I seem to have made a mistake. This isn't your package after all." Relief washed over me as he handed back the package and turned to leave. I couldn't believe my luck. It seemed my intuition had saved me from a potentially dangerous situation. I closed and locked the door, my heart still racing. But the sense of security was short-lived. As I watched through the window, I saw the man didn't walk away as expected. Instead, he stood on the front porch, his phone to his ear, speaking quietly. I strained to hear his conversation, but couldn't make out the words. Fear gripped me once again. I knew I had to call the police, but I didn't want to make any noise that might alert him to my actions. I crept into the kitchen and dialed 911, speaking in hushed tones to the dispatcher, explaining the situation and giving her my address. As I hung up the phone, I glanced out the window again. The man was still there, speaking into his phone and pacing anxiously. It was clear that he was waiting for something or someone. My heart sank as I heard the sound of a car engine approaching. A second vehicle pulled up in front of my house, and another man stepped out. They exchanged words briefly before both of them turned to face my front door. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped. I knew I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to act fast to protect myself. I quietly moved through the house, locking every window and door, searching for any means of escape. Then, as I reached the back of the house, I heard the sound of breaking glass. The intruders had smashed one of the windows to gain access. My heart raced as I considered my options. I couldn't hide forever, and the situation was growing increasingly dangerous. I made my way to the bedroom, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. I knew I needed a weapon, something to defend myself. I spotted a heavy flashlight on the bedside table, and I gripped it tightly, ready to confront the intruders if necessary. I could hear them moving through the house now, their footsteps growing closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I crouched behind the bedroom door, the flashlight raised, prepared to strike. As the first intruder entered the room, I swung the flashlight with all my strength, striking him in the head. He cried out in pain and staggered back, crashing into the second intruder who was entering the room behind him. Their momentary disarray gave me the opportunity to flee. I bolted from the room and raced down the hallway, making a beeline for the front door. With a surge of adrenaline, I flung the door open and sprinted out into the street, not stopping until I reached a neighbor's house. I pounded on their door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I begged them to call the police. Moments later, I heard sirens approaching, and a wave of relief washed over me. The police arrived, apprehending the intruders who were still inside my home. It was later revealed that the two men had sinister intentions and a history of criminal activity. My quick thinking and determination had saved me from a potentially life-threatening situation. In the aftermath, my sense of security was shattered. I installed a security system in my home, and my husband and I became much more vigilant about safety. My girlfriend had gone to pick up our kids from school. The house was quiet, and I decided to make the most of this rare solitude by relaxing on the couch and catching up on some reading. As I immersed myself in the pages of a gripping novel, the peace was suddenly shattered by a loud, urgent knocking at the front door. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly set my book aside, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I cautiously approached the door, my eyes darting toward the peephole. Through the fisheye lens, I saw a man standing on the porch. He was wearing a faded jacket, and his face was obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaky. The man didn't respond. Instead, he continued to knock, this time more forcefully. The knocking seemed relentless, as if he was determined to get my attention. I decided to speak again, louder this time, my apprehension growing. I asked, "Who is it?" Still, there was no response, only the incessant knocking. Fear gnawed at me as I contemplated my next steps. I considered calling my girlfriend or the police, but I didn't want to overreact to what could be a harmless situation. Summoning all my courage, I decided to confront the stranger and find out what he wanted. I slowly unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door a crack, keeping the security chain in place to prevent him from entering. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice steadier now, but my heart racing. The man finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. His expression was a mixture of anxiety and desperation. "Please, you have to help me," he pleaded. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over me. "Help you with what?" I asked cautiously. "I'm being chased," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "I need to hide. They're after me." My mind raced, and I couldn't help but wonder whether this was some sort of elaborate ruse or a desperate ploy to gain entry into my home. But something about the man's demeanor seemed genuine, and the fear in his eyes appeared all too real. "I can't help you," I said firmly, deciding it was best to keep the stranger at bay while I considered my options. "You need to leave." As I attempted to close the door, the man's desperation reached a fever pitch. He shoved his foot into the narrowing gap and pushed against the door with all his strength. Panic surged through me as I struggled to keep the door from swinging open. "Please," he begged, his eyes wide with terror. "They're coming. You have to let me in." With an adrenaline-fueled burst of strength, I managed to force the door shut, slamming and locking it. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood on the other side, my hands trembling. The man continued to pound on the door, his pleas growing more frantic. "You don't understand. They're going to kill me." I knew I had to make a quick decision. I reached for my phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher as calmly as I could, all while the stranger continued to pound on the door behind me. Within minutes, I heard the sirens approaching. The man outside must have heard them too, because he suddenly stopped banging on the door and fled. The police arrived shortly afterward, and I gave them a detailed description of the man and his bizarre behavior. As I watched the officers search the area, a sense of relief washed over me. They never did find the mysterious stranger, and I was left with unanswered questions about who he was and why he had sought refuge at my doorstep. My wife had gone out for some grocery shopping. Our suburban neighborhood was usually peaceful, and I had never experienced anything out of the ordinary during my time living here. As I settled down on the couch, flipping through TV channels and trying to find something to pass the time, I couldn't help but feel the creeping unease that often accompanies solitude. The house seemed quieter than usual, and the creaks and groans of the old building took on a more sinister tone in the absence of my wife's presence. I shook off the uneasiness and tried to immerse myself in a movie, hoping it would provide a temporary distraction. But as the film played on, I couldn't help but notice every little sound, every subtle shift in the house's atmosphere. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a window being opened. My heart lurched in my chest as I froze, straining to listen. It couldn't be my wife. She'd taken the car, and her return was still hours away. I muted the TV and sat in tense silence, my ears finely tuned to the sounds of the house. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the hallway just beyond the living room. Fear gripped me like a vice, and I knew I couldn't stay put. With my heart pounding, I crept off the couch and moved quietly toward the hallway, my mind racing. I had to confront whatever was happening and protect our home. As I peeked around the corner, my worst fears were confirmed. A man, a complete stranger, was standing in the hallway, illuminated by the soft, filtered light from a nearby window. He had a scruffy beard and wild eyes, like a predator sizing up its prey. Our eyes locked, and I was paralyzed with terror as I watched him slowly raise a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. My instinct screamed at me to run, to call the police, but I was trapped in that moment, unable to tear my gaze away from this intruder. The man took a step toward me, and that's when panic finally jolted me into action. I turned and sprinted for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest like a sledgehammer. As I fumbled with the locks, I could hear him pursuing me, his heavy footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched the door open and burst out into the yard, gasping for breath. I didn't dare look back. I ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on their door in sheer desperation. Thankfully, they let me in and called the police. As I sat there, trembling and waiting for the authorities to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability and violation. Our safe haven had been invaded, and I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if I hadn't been alert enough to escape. I lived alone in a cozy suburban house, a place where I found solace after a long day's work. My routine was predictable. Come home, make dinner, watch some TV, and then off to bed. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happened here, and I liked it that way. One evening, as I was getting ready to retire to bed, I heard a faint, unfamiliar sound. It was subtle, like the softest of whispers carried on the wind. I strained my ears, trying to identify the source. I initially brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, a subtle creak on the wooden floor, like the sound of a footstep. My heart began to race as I grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed, my only form of protection. The house was shrouded in darkness, and I hesitated to turn on the lights, fearing it would give away my position. I inched my way into the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible. The dim glow of a nearby streetlight cast eerie shadows across the hallway. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a stray animal or a gust of wind. But deep down, I knew it was something more sinister. As I moved toward the living room, the source of the sound, my heart sank. A figure stood there in the darkness, their silhouette barely visible. Fear paralyzed me momentarily, and I struggled to find my voice. "Who's there?" I finally managed to stammer. No response. The figure just stood there, unmoving. I mustered all the courage I had left and flicked on the living room light. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. A man, a complete stranger, was standing there, his eyes locked onto mine. He was dressed in ragged clothing, his face unshaven, and his eyes were hollow, devoid of any emotion. In his hand, he held a knife, its blade glinting ominously in the light. My heart was pounding so loudly that I thought he could hear it. Panic set in, and I raised the baseball bat defensively. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, the knife gleaming menacingly. In that moment, I knew I had to defend myself. I swung the bat with all the force I could muster, connecting with his arm and knocking the knife from his hand. He let out a cry of pain, stumbling backward. I took that opportunity to flee, darting out of the front door and into the safety of my neighbor's house. The police were called, and they arrived at my house in a matter of minutes. They searched the premises and apprehended the intruder, who had taken refuge in my closet. Turns out, he was a homeless man who had wandered into my home seeking shelter. He had no malicious intent, but his presence had sent me into a nightmarish ordeal. The encounter left me shaken and scarred. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability and fear, even in the place I had considered my sanctuary. I invested in a comprehensive security system and made sure all my doors and windows were fortified. Living alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, I relished in the solitude it provided. My evenings were quiet, spent reading or watching TV, and it had become a place where I felt safe and secure. Little did I know that one night, that sense of security would be shattered. It was a dark and stormy night, rain pouring down relentlessly. The distant rumble of thunder added to the eerie atmosphere as I curled up on the couch, engrossed in a mystery novel. The sudden sound of my doorbell ringing sent a jolt of surprise through me. Who on earth would be visiting on a night like this? Reluctantly, I got up to answer the door, peering through the peephole. A man, drenched from head to toe, stood on my doorstep. He held a dripping wet Bible in one hand and wore a disheveled, soaked suit. His appearance sent a shiver down my spine, but I couldn't just leave him out there in the storm. I opened the door, trying to hide my unease. "Can I help you?" The man smiled warmly, rainwater dripping from his hair. "I'm from the church," he said. "I was passing by when the storm hit, and I got caught in it. I was wondering if I could seek shelter here for a while and maybe talk to you about our congregation." I hesitated, not entirely comfortable with the idea of inviting a stranger into my home. But his mention of the church made me feel guilty for being distrustful. Besides, it was pouring rain, and he looked miserable. "All right," I said reluctantly. "You can come in, but just for a little while." He thanked me profusely as he stepped inside. I gave him a towel to dry off and offered a seat in the living room. He began talking about the church, its mission, and its community activities. I listened politely, though his presence still made me uneasy. As the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His eyes, while friendly, seemed too intense, and I noticed he was constantly glancing around my house. His questions grew more personal, asking if I lived alone and what my daily routines were like. I began to feel trapped, a creeping sense of dread building within me. I wanted him out of my home, but I didn't want to be impolite. The storm outside continued to rage, and the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, he abruptly stood up. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said with a forced smile. "I should be going now." Relieved, I walked him to the door, my heart pounding. As he stepped back out into the rain, he turned to me and said, "You have a lovely home. I'll be back to visit soon." The words sent a chill down my spine. I quickly locked the door behind him, my mind racing. Who was that man, and why had he really come to my home on such a stormy night? The sense of unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly avoided a nightmare. That night, I double-checked all the locks, windows, and security systems in my house. I couldn't shake the fear that he might return, and I wanted to be prepared. Sleep eluded me, and I spent the night on edge, wondering what his true intentions had been. The chilling encounter had left me with a haunting sense of vulnerability, and it was a long time before I felt safe in my own home again. I had just returned from a week-long vacation with some friends, and the exhaustion was starting to set in. My small, cozy apartment had never looked so welcoming. I lugged my suitcase up the stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped inside, feeling a familiar sense of relief. The first thing I noticed was the eerie silence. It wasn't the comforting stillness I had expected, but something far more unsettling. The apartment was supposed to be empty. I lived alone. Yet, as I stood there in the doorway, a wave of dread washed over me. I could sense that something was horribly wrong. I cautiously moved through the dimly lit living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The television was on, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I never left it on while I was away, and I certainly didn't remember it being on when I left for vacation. As I crept further into the apartment, my ears caught a soft, almost imperceptible sound of a whisper, a breath, something that should not have been there. Panic surged through me as I realized I was not alone. There was someone else here, lurking in the shadows of my own home. Adrenaline coursing through my veins, I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on. The sudden burst of light revealed a figure standing in the corner, partially hidden behind the curtains. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the intruder. It was a man, a complete stranger, standing there in my apartment. His eyes were wild, darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. He was wearing dirty, tattered clothes, and his unkempt appearance sent shivers down my spine. "What the hell are you doing here?" I managed to stammer, my voice quivering with fear. The man didn't respond, his gaze locked onto me. He looked deranged, unstable, and I had no idea what he was capable of. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Had he broken in while I was away? How had he entered my apartment? I reached for my phone in my pocket, my fingers trembling. I needed to call the police, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the intruder. I dialed 911 as discreetly as I could and whispered my situation to the operator. The man took a step closer, his gaze never leaving me. I could see the tension in his body, the unpredictability in his eyes. Fear and anger boiled within me, and I backed away slowly, keeping the phone to my ear. Just then, the operator's voice crackled for the phone. "The police are on their way. Stay on the line with me." I nodded, relieved to have someone on the other end of the line. But the intruder seemed to sense that time was running out. With a sudden burst of movement, he lunged toward me, a manic expression on his face. Pure terror propelled me into action. I sidestepped his attack, narrowly avoiding his grasp, and bolted for the door. As I burst out into the hallway, I heard the intruder shouting behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I raced down the stairs, heart pounding, until I was safely outside. Within minutes, the police arrived, and they quickly apprehended the intruder. It turned out he had broken in while I was away, seeking shelter and food. He was homeless, desperate, and mentally unstable. It was a terrifying encounter, one that left me shaken to my core. Living alone had always been my preference. I cherished the solitude, the freedom to do as I pleased without anyone else's interference. It was a quiet life, but it was my life, and I relished it. Little did I know that one ordinary evening, that life would turn into a living nightmare. It was a chilly autumn night, and I had just returned home from a long day at work. The familiar routine of making dinner and settling in for some TV played out like countless evenings before. I had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. As I sat on my couch, engrossed in a crime drama, I began to hear faint sounds, like footsteps echoing in the hallway just outside my apartment. I paused the TV, straining to listen. Perhaps it was just a neighbor or the building settling. There were countless explanations for such noises. But then the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Panic started to creep in as I realized that whoever was out there was heading toward my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I considered my options. Could it be a neighbor who needed assistance, or something far more sinister? Before I could decide, the doorknob began to turn slowly, almost cautiously. My pulse quickened, and I knew I had to act fast. I tiptoed over to the door, my breath shallow, and peered through the peephole. What I saw sent shockwaves through me, a man I didn't recognize, attempting to gain entry into my apartment. My mind raced. What should I do? I couldn't call the police without concrete evidence of a threat. It was just one man, and I didn't want to overreact. Maybe he was simply at the wrong door. As I hesitated, the man outside continued to fiddle with the lock. It became painfully clear that he had no intention of leaving. Fear gripped me, but I knew I couldn't stay paralyzed by it. I had to confront him and find out what he wanted. I took a deep breath, mustered every ounce of courage, and swung open the door. The man, startled by my sudden appearance, took a step back. His disheveled appearance, wild eyes, and the odor of alcohol on his breath made it clear that he wasn't a lost neighbor. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice quaking but determined. He stammered, mumbling something incoherent. I repeated my question, more forcefully this time, and he finally managed to blurt out, "I thought this was my friend's place." His explanation sounded flimsy, and I wasn't buying it. I had never seen this man before, and his erratic behavior sent alarms ringing in my head. I told him to leave immediately, but he just stood there, his eyes darting around my apartment. That's when I made a critical mistake. I turned to reach for my phone to call the police. In that split second, the intruder lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. Panic and adrenaline coursed through me as I fought back, struggling to push him off. We grappled on the floor, the room spinning around us. I managed to land a punch, disorienting him for a moment. It was all I needed to scramble to my feet and make a run for it. I bolted out of my apartment and down the hallway, not looking back until I reached the safety of a neighbor's door. My neighbor, a burly man with a concerned look on his face, let me in. He called the police while I gasped for air, relaying the terrifying ordeal I had just experienced. Within minutes, the authorities arrived and apprehended the intruder. It turned out that the man had a history of mental health issues and had been involved in prior incidents. I shuddered to think about what might have happened had I not acted quickly. The encounter left me scarred, not just physically, but emotionally, too. My husband had gone to visit his brother, leaving me home alone. We'd been married for 5 years, and while I cherished our time together, I also valued the rare moments of solitude. Little did I know that this particular evening would be etched into my memory as the most horrifying night of my life. I decided to spend the evening relaxing in the living room, catching up on some reading. The soft glow of the reading lamp cast comforting shadows across the room, and the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that interrupted the stillness of the house. With a warm blanket draped over me, I settled into my book, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had inexplicably settled over me. As the minutes ticked by, I found myself glancing at the clock more often than usual. It was getting late, and I couldn't help but worry about my husband's long absence. He hadn't called or texted to let me know when he'd be back, which was unlike him. My imagination started to run wild with all the potential reasons for his delay. Just when I was on the verge of calling him to check in, a noise from the backyard startled me. It was a faint rustling, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my heart race. I shook off my unease, attributing the sound to the wind or perhaps a stray animal. Yet, the sensation of being watched lingered. I decided to get up and check the locks on the doors and windows, a habit I developed since moving to this neighborhood. As I moved through the house, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The windows were secure, the doors locked, but the unease remained, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Returning to the living room, I picked up my book in an attempt to regain some semblance of normalcy. However, the feeling of being watched persisted, intensifying with each passing moment. It was as though an invisible presence lurked just beyond my line of sight. I tried to brush it off as an overactive imagination, but when I glanced at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, I froze. There, on the other side of the glass, was a figure, a tall silhouette that seemed to be peering into my home. My heart leaped into my throat, and I gasped in shock. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my phone to call the police. As I dialed 911, I watched in terror as the intruder, realizing I'd seen him, moved away from the door. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, but every second that passed felt like an eternity. Huddled in the corner of the room, clutching my phone and praying for the police to arrive, I could hear faint sounds coming from outside. It was the intruder, circling the house, trying to find a way in. The rational part of my brain told me to stay quiet and hidden, but the fear was overwhelming. Then, the worst possible thing happened. The power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and I was left in absolute terror. I felt vulnerable and trapped, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to hear any sign of the intruder's approach. Minutes passed like hours, and finally, the distant wail of sirens pierced the silence. Relief washed over me as the police arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the darkness. They searched the property, and after what felt like an eternity, they emerged with a man in custody. It turned out that the intruder was a stranger who had been lurking in the neighborhood. My husband's prolonged absence had given him the opportunity to target our home. The police assured me that they would thoroughly investigate the incident, but I was too shaken to fully grasp their words. My husband returned home, alarmed by the police cars outside our house. I rushed into his arms, grateful that he was safe and that the nightmare was over. But the encounter with the intruder left scars that would never fully heal. I could no longer feel safe in my own home, and the shadows of that terrifying night continued to haunt my thoughts. That night, I learned the true meaning of fear, the heart-pounding, bone-chilling terror that lingers long after the danger has passed. It was a nightmare I wished I could forget, but one that would forever remind me of the vulnerability that comes with being home alone, waiting for a loved one to return.